This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Well, thank you, Quint, for that remarkable introduction. I think it's unique among all my introductions, and I thank you very much for it. It's great to be here amongst so many friends. I recognize tons of faces, and it's nice. I give a lot of talks, and I've never given one here. So it's great to see. It's great to see my friends. So in this talk, I'm not going to show you gee whiz AI technology or robots or anything like that. As it was described in the invitation, I will discuss the prospects and perils of AI and provide a perspective on its past, present, and future. You know, most of the ideas in this talk over the years took shape with interactions with colleagues here at IHMC, naturally. And over many years, we argued and talked about lots of things, and I'll share those with you. But the person that had the biggest impact on this talk really was Pat Hayes. Is Pat here? Ah, there he is. So Pat and I are friends of long standing. We're not old friends, you note. We're friends of long standing. And Pat has had a lot of influence on my thinking. And we started on many of these ideas in the 1990s. That said, responsibility for all the wrong-headed parts is mine. Don't blame Pat. I would also like to thank Andy Marlette for the wonderful cartoons that we will see tonight. He does good work. He does good work. So as George Bernard Shaw once observed, being slandered is better than being ignored. So maybe AI researchers like myself should be happy. After decades of pundits and philosophers arguing that AI is provably impossible, suddenly that argument has been replaced with the assertion that not only is it possible, but that superhuman AI represents the greatest danger ever faced by the human race. So in only about a decade, it went from you can't do it, that was most of my career, to you shouldn't do it. Right? Very strange transition. My purpose in this talk will be to draw our attention to an interesting historical parallel, another older technology, which was also controversial and thought to be impossible, and then deemed to be a great danger to the human race. That is artificial flight, which we will refer to here on out as AF. The parallel between AI and AF is illuminating and suggests that the traditional view of the goal of AI, that is to create a machine that can successfully imitate human behavior, is misdirected. From the very beginning, attempts at flight sought to imitate the behavior and some implementation details of birds. The goal seemed to be AB, artificial birds, not AF, artificial flight. In particular, it was taken for granted that flying necessarily involved feathers and vigorous flapping. Here we see Icarus, providing a cautionary tale of human technological hubris leading to certain destruction. Flight has always been one of humanity's oldest dreams, and the best thinkers over 1,000 years had an opinion on it. It was one of the big ideas, kind of like AI today. For example, Descartes had some fascinating correspondence about the possibility of flight in the summer of 1640. Notice how modern Descartes is here in his thinking about machines. And the language he uses. So Descartes says, for birds themselves, at least in my view, are such machines. Interesting. That's a very early time to have that thought. But then he goes on. So of course it's possible, but then he says it's not possible physically or morally speaking, because one would need springs, I like this part, so subtle and at the same time so strong they could not be made by man. So why was he thinking of springs? Because he was thinking of flapping, right? Flying was flapping. And naturally, you might need springs. But early attempts at flight, these attempts just fostered a lot of psychological unease. They heightened the associations I mentioned earlier of inescapable judgment and vengeance. And it just seemed dangerously presumptuous to force one's ways to the heavens. And ecclesiastical writers warned of dire consequences if this nonsense continued. Over time, concern about the potential practical misuse of flight replaced the religious issues. And admonitory comments on flight became commonplace by the 17th century. Critics were alarmed at what flight might do to society, and they called for it to be banned or regulated or punished. Perhaps actually I can see what they were thinking. They were probably thinking about contemporary airlines. So here we see some language by Plouk, Noel Anton Plouk, an interesting character indeed. Plouk imagined that flight would cause people to live in barbarous isolation. And let's look at this wonderful language. I won't read it all to you, but my favorite part is he says, we should retire like them, meaning the birds, to inaccessible rocks and craggy mountains, from whence we should from time to time sally down upon the fruits and animals that accommodate our necessities. You don't hear stuff like this anymore, right? And then from the plain, what would we do? We should immediately soar up to our dens in our charnel rooms. Just this stuff, you can't make this up, right? And here is an artist's depiction, perhaps, of Plouk's imaginary flying person. So it looks like he's swooped down and stole some eggs or something. Now, Johann Karamo Lubkowitz expressed the emotion that if men were meant to fly, God would have given them wings. So, God denied to men the faculty of flight so that they might lead a quiet and tranquil life. For if they knew how to fly, they would always be in perpetual danger. Whose life would be free from danger? What house would be safe from robbers? What city would be safe against the enemy? In truth, no care, no foresight would be sufficient to protect men, especially at night, from the flying foe. And so mankind was treated mercifully when he was denied the wings which he would have misused. Amazing stuff. Nevertheless, several actual attempts at flight were made, probably the most famous being that of Besnier in 1670. Besnier apparently managed to glide from the top of the Notre Dame Cathedral into the Seine River. Perhaps by keeping himself as light as possible. This led to some moral criticism at the time, as many assumed, naturally, that flight necessarily implied nakedness. Now, this question of naked flyers was relevant even and especially in academia. Johann Lubkowitz Hahnemann, acting as a praeses for a dissertation by Georges Matthias Hirsch, opined that one needn't really worry too much about an onslaught of naked flyers. And I just love this guy. So he notes that nakedness is unacceptable. Then, in any case, we should need protection from heat and cold and from the attacks of flies and fleas. A flying outfit would therefore be necessary, made perhaps from waxed linen or parchment or lambskin. The whole suit should be covered with feathers and made to lie smoothly on the skin without wrinkles or folds. It should in particular fit tightly over the buttocks and loins, though not so tightly it might split and let in the inclement air. It's great stuff. Over the years, pundits and futurists continued to fear AF. As recently as the 1920s, books argued passionately that heavier-than-air flight had no future because it was too dangerous to society and should be made illegal by international agreement. In capitals all around the world, including our own, lobbyists strove to pass laws forbidding attempts at flight. 3 decades later, in 1954, but in much the same spirit, the French passed several local ordinances prohibiting spaceships, or cigar volant, as the French call them, flying cigars, from landing in their vineyards. Violators were to be taken to the pound. So here is this wonderful French ordinance. Let's take a look at this. Article 1. The overflight, the landing, and the takeoff of aircraft known as flying saucers or flying cigars, whatever their nationality is, are prohibited on the territory of the community. Any aircraft known as a flying saucer or flying cigar which should land on the territory of the community will be immediately held in custody. Okay. The amazing Elan of the French, a people who pass a law to govern disobedient extraterrestrials and imagine that they will impound them. Okay? So, where do we go? Well, here we see this is an actual cigar volant on a label of Bonnie Doon wine, apparently desecrating a vineyard in Shineruff to Pop. So maybe they were right. And apparently, this law has done a great job in discouraging such landings. Until 1783, though, artificial flight was more or less controlled falling. And for many years, the empirical scene was decidedly discouraging. And in 1660, you don't want to be that guy. He went zero distance like his predecessors, but that had to hurt. If it took him 4 seconds to go zero distance. I think it involves ricocheting and bouncing off things. This could not have been good. But even with this, people kept on trying. Artificial flight typically lasted only a few seconds, as you can see here. In 1783, the Montgolfier brothers built the first hot air balloon and rose majestically above Paris. Ballooning was one thing, but the idea of flying like a bird was much more tantalizingly attractive. Strong AF was the goal. Flapping was seen as necessary for flying, so the equivalent just didn't scratch the itch. So ballooning was seen as, that's not really flying, you're sort of floating about. Flying had to involve flapping. AF was essentially the flapping problem. From the very beginning, attempts at flight sought to imitate the implementation details of birds. In particular, it was taken for granted that flying involved feathers and vigorous flapping. One can imagine, in a much earlier time, an ancient Greek professor of aeronautical engineering. They had those, standing at the edge of a cliff with his graduate students. After some consideration, the professor decides that Hercules probably has the best opportunity for flight, given his exceptional power-to-weight ratio. But soon, Hercules is covered in feathers and outfitted with wings, and then off the cliff he goes, flapping wildly. Sadly, he crashes in a bloody heap at the bottom of the cliff. The professor is naturally undismayed and notes that Hercules was not actually a very good graduate student after all. After carefully examining several birds, the good professor excitedly exclaims, "I've got it." It was sort of a eureka moment for him. And so then he commanded, "Find Achilles and bring him to me." Eventually, poor Achilles is dragged to the cliff and feathered and winged exactly like Hercules. But this time, the professor outfits him with a beak. It must be the beak. The beak is what accounts for flight. Sadly, Achilles suffers the same fate as his fellow graduate student before him. The professor then went back to studying birds and decided that perhaps the secret is not in the beak, but rather in the feet. Kidding aside, even in relatively modern times, much scientific debate revolved around exactly how all this flapping could be accomplished. The structural similarities and differences of birds and humans had been carefully observed, noted, and extensively studied. After all, if you took a broad view, people and birds seem pretty much the same. Eventually, and this is from a scholarly text, by the way, eventually, by 1872, it had been shown conclusively by von Helmholtz, Borelli, and others that man could never fly by his own muscular force. It was physically impossible. Okay. As early as 1854, Le Bris realized that flapping was not the trick. This was a great insight. By observing soaring albatross on the edge of a cliff, he would watch that they would rise in the air, and he thought, that's the trick. So his belief was that given a strong enough wind, his flying machine would rise in the air and reproduce all of the beautiful movements of the soaring albatross. Unfortunately, the call of the wild was strong, and although flapperless flight was born, Le Bris could not quite shake the bird. So he was willing to give up flapping, he was eager to give up flapping, but not ready to give up beaks and feathers, as you can see. Thus, as late as 1854, so this was only 50 years before the Wright brothers, we were still building artificial birds, not artificial flyers, complete with beaks and feathers. And as I mentioned, half a century later, the Wright brothers would fly, no beak, no feathers. But there's a big shift here, and I'm sure you've already seen it, but I want to point it out. The Wright brothers were not trying to mimic birds or to build an ornithopter. They asked very different questions. They weren't interested in flapping feathers and beaks. They were interested in notions like lift and stability, in the dynamics of turning in the air. And we'll come back to that. The histories of AI and AF are wonderfully analogous. Both of these strongly held human ambitions were, for a long time, focused on imitating the behavior of the biological exemplar. And this mistake, in both cases, misdirected these fields. So we have just heard about how AF was focused on bird mimicry. How did AI become focused on human mimicry? In 1950, the British mathematician Alan Turing, a brilliant man, when arguing in a philosophy journal for the possibility of intelligent machines, suggested that a suitable test for intelligence would be an imitation game in which a human judge holds a three-way conversation with a computer and another human and tries to tell them apart. The judge is free to turn the conversation to any topic, and the successful machine should converse as well and as convincingly as the human. And if the judge cannot tell the difference after a reasonable amount of time, then the machine has passed the test. It is able to seem human to a human, and therefore, Turing argued, one would be compelled to bestow the moniker of intelligent on it. A nice thought experiment for a philosophy journal, and for arguing with philosophers, which I can assure you is a waste of time, but not a suitable goal for a scientific field. As we and others have noted, starting a textbook on AI with the Turing test, as some still do, seems roughly akin to starting a textbook on aeronautical engineering with an explanation that the goal of the field is to make machines that fly so exactly like pigeons that other pigeons think they're pigeons. This doesn't seem to be working out for our artificial pigeon over here. Now, I'd like to note that the proper aim of AI is much larger than simply mimicking human behavior. The scientific goal is to provide a computational account of mental ability itself, not merely human mentality or a mimicry of human mentality. Artificial intelligence is, in my view, a singularly poor name, arising perhaps naturally from the Turing test perspective that we talked about earlier. Everyone appreciates that it would be silly to refer to aircraft as an example of artificial flight. No, it really truly is flight. And now that we understand them, it's clear that the laws of aerodynamics apply to any wing, natural or artificial. And in the same way, we think that the laws of thought apply to reasoning done by any cognitive agent, human or machine, or we think most interestingly of all, a combination of both working together. So, perhaps computation itself is the air that provides the lift for the wings of thought. But one can reasonably ask whether we have yet found the airfoil for cognition. As mentioned earlier, many futurist thinkers fret that AI systems will soon take over the planet and treat us like domestic pets, or much worse. Ironically, in fictional accounts of superhuman AI run amok, the source of the hazard is often not that the machine is too intelligent or that it's too artificial, but that it was too human. Consider the fictional robot HAL in Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 Space Odyssey. This account of AI run amok has shaped the worries of pundits for 50 years. HAL had failings of pride, was prone to paranoia, and had passionately held desires. Smart as it was, the stress of life, as it were, was too much for HAL, and it went mad. A human tragedy. Let's remember HAL a little here.
Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal. Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal. Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Where the hell did you get that idea, Hal?
Dave, although you took very thorough precautions in the pod against my hearing you, I could see your lips move.
Hal, I won't argue with you anymore. Open the doors.
Dave, This conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.
So, what went wrong with HAL? Well, I think you know by now from what we've already discussed. HAL's design reflects the old and misguided ambition of AI, that is to create artificial humans with ambitions, hopes, dreams, and independent personhood. A really bad idea in my view. Perhaps we will be much better at instilling agreed upon beneficial moral and ethical frameworks in our machines than we have accomplished with our children. But I doubt it. As an aside, I'd just like to point out that there are simpler, more reliable, and cost-effective methods for creating humans, as your parents have all accomplished. In any case, the current application of AI in the real world is nothing like this. It's very different than these human-like AI systems from science fiction or the dystopian dreams of philosophers and futurists. Rather than creating a single all-knowing intelligence, modern AI is all around us. It's embedded in most of our systems. It's in our automobiles, our phones, our routers, our search engines. And the idea is to make everything a little smarter, thereby making all of us collectively a little smarter. Now, recently, there was a story in the New York Times, a former newspaper, that quoted Elon Musk urging the governors of the states to immediately adopt AI legislation before robots, and this is a quote, I'm not making this up, start going down the street killing people. So here we see his vision of robots behaving badly, or robots gone wild. Now, one can hardly take such comments seriously, and yet the warnings of the hazards of intelligent machines has become a cottage industry. Some folks seem to delight in seeing how endlessly credulous the media is with respect to their pronouncements. But this is an old story, a really old story. People were very, very worried about trains because they thought it would be dangerous to move that quickly across the earth. And as we have just seen, heavier than air flight was absolutely scorned, not just for technical reasons, but mostly for moral reasons. I take Mr. Musk's comments in the same spirit. Any really remarkable technology is often perceived as wrong-headed, morally bankrupt, and/or dangerous. But many things are dangerous. It is about the wisdom with which we use these things. In this respect, technology is neutral and does not convey an inherent moral component. Whether we will, as a species, wisely apply our technologies, that is very much in question. When hands are wringing, they're often wrung over an imagined dystopian future in which an AI, a singular, an AI, somehow converges or hits the singularity, and then it transcends our abilities, runs amok, takes over the planet. You know the story, right? This kind of reference to an AI in the singular is very misleading at best. It's akin to saying, near the end of World War II, the United States dropped a physics on Japan. No, it was a bomb. An application of physics, yes, but not physics itself. AI, like physics, is an intellectual field of exploration, creation, and scientific discovery. One can imagine a near endless list of possible applications of AI, and these can be and will be used for good or ill. It's up to us. But we should not imagine that our salvation from malevolent machines will be brought to us by our state legislators drafting laws to regulate their behavior. This is passing moral responsibility from us to our machines. Or we should imagine that some kinds of knowledge should be regarded as forbidden fruit of the human brain, and not pursued. That's equally ridiculous. Besides, frankly, we have already bitten from this apple. In recent days, one hears much about autonomous cars, autonomous delivery drones, autonomous weapon systems, etc., etc., etc. The term autonomy has become a locus of sloppy language, naive expectations, and, as a partial consequence, much fear and concern. Here are the first two definitions one finds for autonomous. First, not controlled by others or outside forces. Second, independent in mind or judgment, self-directed. Now, there is much bound up in these words: controlled, independent, self-directed. To better understand the meaning, let's look at the Greek derivation of the term. So, as you can see here, autonomous is derived from ancient Greek, where auto, meaning self, and nomos, law, are combined to mean one who gives oneself one's own law. This definition probably explains why society, on the average, tends to incarcerate people who act as if they are autonomous in any strong sense. The autonomous guy is the naked guy at the stoplight screaming at cars. He's autonomous. HAL 9000 was, unfortunately for the human crew, autonomous. In common usage, when discussing AI systems, autonomy is typically taken to mean many different things. And this is part of the problem. Sometimes autonomy means automation. Sometimes it means something akin to intelligence. It typically implies various degrees of independent behavior. But autonomy by itself is not a very impressive goal. Lots of things are autonomous and yet quite stupid. In fact, the two traits are often strongly correlated. Now, I am putatively at least a little bit intelligent, and I display a degree of self-initiative. But I am certainly not autonomous. I'm married. Why would we grant our machines a freedom which we do not enjoy ourselves? Nancy and I are not independent, we're interdependent. One's relationship with their spouse, activities at work, and nearly all other joint human endeavors are fundamentally teamwork relationships, enabled by interdependence relations, not independent relations. Well-understood interdependence relations are critical for all teams, whether human or machine, or most interestingly, human and machine. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll get off this after this, I am not a fan of the term artificial intelligence. In many respects, AI would be better treated as meaning amplified intelligence or augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. First, just as there is nothing artificial about heavier than air flight, AF, there is nothing artificial about the intelligence displayed by machines. It is certainly not human-like, but it is, for sure, a form of real intelligence. Human-centered AI applications extend our cognitive, sensory, and sensory abilities rather than set out to duplicate or mimic them or to be in some kind of a fanciful competition with them. These are essentially cognitive orthotics and prosthetics, that is, technological systems that leverage and extend our cognitive abilities. This notion of cognitive orthoses is not new. It's old and has deep roots. Humanity has always recognized that the powers of the mind are limited and has always made devices to compensate for those limitations. Our most obvious cognitive limitation is memory, and writing is a device for storing information outside the head so that it does not have to be remembered. As soon as it could be economically reproduced and distributed, writing became, in Europe, a force that fundamentally changed society. Within 3 years after Gutenberg, Modern science had been created. Ecclesiastical authority had been reduced. The divine right of kings had largely vanished, and democratic forms of government had emerged. Calculation shows much the same history. Roman enumeration methods made addition and multiplication and division essentially impossible, except for the very gifted. To compensate, the abacus was used in Europe as an arithmetic orthoses. So, in this same spirit, rather than working toward the development of some super intelligent AI overlord, the human is at the center of our efforts at IHMC. We strive to develop science and technology in service of leveraging and extending human cognition, locomotion, perception, and resilience. And this really should not be a surprising idea. The reason that we as a species ever developed technology in the first place was first to survive, and then second, to extend the scope of human activity. And this is what IHMC is really all about. Enhancing humans, then, where does it all end? Well, there are lots of ways this could all work out. Some visions of our enhanced futures seem positively wonderful, and others are deeply disturbing. Amplified humans with extended health spans could lead to a new renaissance in a period of material abundance of the likes the world has never seen. Or, alternatively, we might evolve into a flaccid, perpetually frightened and easily offended chair-bound species, living each in our own private virtual reality. So Homer Simpson is today, and you see the sort of World War II era man behind him. He has to avert his gaze when he thinks of the future. And this is one of our possible futures in front of Homer, but it doesn't need to be. It's one possible future. For all of human history, up to now, we have only had a small influence, and we've only had little choice in how we as a species developed. Very small. This process was driven largely by massive, uncontrolled environmental pressures, and it took place over a very long period of time. But now it's going to be different. Much of what happens to our species will be something that we either consciously or unconsciously decided. This thought is both a source of pleasure and a rather hopeful idea, but also a potentially worrisome notion, depending on how things work out for our culture. We will now have options fostered by new science and new technology that humans have never had before. This dilemma of human choice will be increasingly central as time goes on. I am all for options, but let's hope that we choose wisely. To paraphrase the bard, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our technology, but in ourselves. Humans have the ability to invent all sorts of wondrous things, and we sometimes use our technologies for great good to elevate the human condition, and sometimes for ill, and sometimes for purely foolish purposes. It's up to us to choose. So, just because we can do something, should we? Every day we hear about the accelerating pace of progress. But technological change is not always progress. In short, I support a human-centered view of progress. My evaluation function for whether something is progress has fundamentally to do with whether it elevates the human condition. Are we better animals than before? Are we smarter, stronger, kinder, happier, more free, living in a better culture? Just because we can do something does not mean that we should do it. I am confident, for example, that IHMC could make a wife-kissing robot. But hey, that's my job. In the end, progress is in the eye of the beholder, and its estimation is shaped by our society and its values. I'm strongly biased in favor of humans. I know this view is out of fashion in many learned circles, but perhaps there is still time for me to learn self-loathing. If we humans end up, as some futurists imagine, working for our machines, we will have deserved our fate. Rather than intelligent computers becoming our rivals or our masters or doing our thinking for us, they should, and in many cases already have, become our amplifiers and our teammates. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you. So I think we have time for some questions. Be sure to wait for the microphone to get to you after I acknowledge you, or folks listening over the internet will only hear my answer. You'll have to guess the question. No questions? No.
Good evening, sir. I'm Anton Ekman. I'm from Oregon, just visiting.
Welcome.
I'm just wondering, in this kind of science that you're exploring, one of the big factors that you seem to come up against is kind of social views and social norms. So would you say that the greater fear for humans is a pseudo or an artificial consciousness, or a superintelligence that makes ours look insignificant?
I think neither is in prospect nor a fear. So nobody would build such a machine. It was kind of most of the point of what I was talking about. If we do that and we build a sort of a paranoid, human-hating machine that takes over the world, too bad for humans. We ought to be out of here.
You mentioned interdependence with machines. If we end up getting too dependent upon them, and if they're electronically or something like that shuts down, and then we can't function, what is our thing we need to worry about there?
That's a big issue, and we shouldn't be dependent on our machines. We should be interdependent with our machines. And it's important when you evaluate something. So, for example, we all have machines now in our homes, in our pockets, one that Julie asked you to silence, right? That are both, you no doubt are to some extent dependent on these devices, but they're not very well designed in many cases, and you're not typically interdependent with that device. So when you think about this, think about whether these technologies have made you a better person, right? And not what the technology is capable of, but how are you using it? So, for example, television. Television could have been a great force for good, and now it's essentially a harmful device. So the force of it isn't in the technology, it's us. And the conversation that you hear a lot in the media is like the Elon Musk story. Oh my God, we need to regulate these machines, or we need to endow them with morals and ethics. The morals and ethics we ought to worry about is here, all right? It's us.
What kind of applications do you have for AI here at IHMC?
Well, we do a lot of work in AI in IHMC, and it was our original focus area and is still one of our big focus areas. And it ranges from the kind of work that I introduced Pat Hayes earlier on foundational issues, and that's also more or less my interest. But others do work on, for example, just one of many. One would be natural language understanding. How do machines and humans communicate in a deep way? So I'm not talking about speech recognition, like when you tell your car, call Ken, and it takes you 4 tries. Your car doesn't know what Ken is. It doesn't know what call is. It's exactly the same as if you clicked to it, if you menued to it, right? There's no understanding, it's just recognition. That's relatively uninteresting. That's a necessary but not sufficient component of language understanding. So we're very interested in language understanding and human-machine dialogue where the intent of your utterance is understood by the machine, not just the symbols. So that would be an example, but there are many others.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting. My name is Tom, and I'm a retired educator. I used to teach science and technology in the classroom. And when I first began, and technology was a novice thing being introduced into the classroom, it was something that just the geeks, were kind of interested in. And my generation over time embraced technology more and more, as well as subsequent generations. And we see that embracement even in a larger community. For example, you see many, many scientists now embracing technology as a solution to many of the problems. And they see, for example, climate change as something that, rather than worry about carbon trading and regulation, and we should invest in technology, that technology is our solution. And I embrace that as well, and I have faith in that. But we are at a time where we have been living in, Moore's law, and now we're having Rose's law, and the paradigm is shifting, and the rate of change, the rapidity of change, it's unprecedented. I mean, we're going from 2,000 qubits to 4,000 by the end of 2018 to maybe 10,000 qubits.
You had a question?
Yes.
Okay.
And so my question is, as our faith is increasing in technology, do we, as we embrace this technological grid, and should we, see some type of vulnerabilities that may exist as this rate of change is occurring so quickly? Should we look at security? Should we look at privacy? Should we look at control? I mean, Wisconsin Supreme Court has already looked at AI boxes, autonomous decision-making boxes, and said, well, we're not going to rule in favor of somebody that wants to look at the source code of this AI box. And in 2018, this year, European Union is looking at having legislation to be able to access code.
Yeah. They're the kind of people I was making fun of. But the idea that the legislators are going to save us is yeah. But this gentleman raised a lot of good points, and I'd like to hit on a few of them. So first, rate of change. I briefly talked about that, but I didn't go into it. Rate of technological change is faster now than ever. Only a fool would dispute that, right? Particularly if you consider computation, right? Computation drives most of that. But technological change is not the same thing as progress. And when I say technological change, it doesn't measure this or weigh the significance of the change. So I'm not actually very impressed by a lot of the change we have today. Consider a person born in 1900. That person would have seen a tremendous evolution. Right? Everything from the Wright brothers to landing on the moon, the advent of computers, the advent of the internet. In 70 years, if they just lived 7 years, if they lived 80 years, oh my goodness. But if they just lived 70 years, they would have seen a kind of fundamental progress that one rarely observes in that short a period. And I say, so let's think if we started at 1970 and went forward 70 years. It's only a thought experiment, but I would postulate you would not find the same fundamental progress. So progress and change are two different things. And when you consider whether something's progress, I would invite you to consider, and this is partly what the gentleman was referring to, is this change progress? Does it improve the human condition? We don't exist to be cogs in the machine. Somebody was telling me how great, I got a ride in one of those self-driving cars, and of course it broke. And the guy was telling me, oh, it'll be great. You'll just be able to answer your emails and work in the car, and you won't have to drive. It's like, wife-kissing robot? Like, how is this a good idea, all right? So we should think carefully, like the gentleman implies, about what the future looks like. But always remember, it's up to us. It doesn't happen to us. We choose it as a species. One more. In the back, I see your hand. Must be you.
Would you comment about AI in medicine, where you see the future going with medicine? Just a specific topic.
Very exciting. So AI in medicine. Yeah, wonderful topic. I recently read, I forget which magazine, and if I remembered, I wouldn't tell you because they seem so foolish. But they had a whole article, the label was something like the end of the physician, right? And it's like your AI system will be your new doc. Well, if that's what you'd like for a doc, no, you don't want that. So AI will amplify physicians, just like all the technology before did. So it makes us more capable as humans. But the idea of replacing the physician really diminishes the idea of what a physician does. The physician does not just look at an image and make a diagnosis, but does a lot more than that. That's the least of it. And so, again, if a society, we allow it to take place, that you say, well, patient 6,942, enter the cubicle. And you go in and say, raise your arms like TSA. Okay. And then it'll say, I'm sorry, but you have frontal lobe dementia. They say, get out, right? If that happens, we will have deserved it. All right, thank you all.